The morning prayers had just ended when they heard the drums. Deep, rhythmic, endless. Sister Sophia pressed her ear against the cold stone wall of her convent and listened. The Ottoman army was closer than yesterday. Much closer. She gathered the younger nuns around her and spoke words she never thought she would say. Hide everything sacred. Burn the records. Prepare for what comes next. This was Belgrade in 1521, and within hours, these women of God would face horrors that history has tried desperately to forget. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire expanded across 3 continents, swallowing kingdoms, principalities, and entire civilizations. Their military machine was legendary, their conquests, swift and brutal, but buried beneath the grand narratives of sultans and battles lies a darker truth, a truth written in the tears of those who could not fight back. Among all the victims of Ottoman expansion, perhaps none suffered more terribly than the Christian nuns who found themselves in the path of conquest. These were not soldiers. They were not politicians or merchants who chose to resist. They were women who had dedicated their lives to prayer, charity, and healing. They lived behind monastery walls, not for protection from the world, but for devotion to something greater than themselves. They fed the poor. They cared for orphans. They copied manuscripts to preserve knowledge. They asked nothing from the world except the freedom to serve God in peace. But peace was the one thing the Ottoman expansion would not grant them. The pattern repeated itself from the Balkans to Anatolia, from the Greek islands to the shores of the Black Sea. First came the scouts, mapping the land, counting the defenders, noting the wealth. Then came the ultimatum, surrender or face siege. For great cities with walls and armies, there was at least the option to fight. But for isolated convents filled with women who had never held weapons, there was no real choice at all. Only the terrible waiting for what everyone knew was coming. We know these stories not from Ottoman records, which often glossed over such events, but from the few survivors who managed to escape, from hidden letters discovered centuries later, and from the testimony of European merchants and diplomats who witnessed scenes that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Each account is a window into a systematic pattern of violence that was as deliberate as it was cruel. Take the fate of the Studenica convent in Serbia. For 3 centuries, it had been a beacon of Orthodox Christianity, home to nearly 200 nuns who spent their days in prayer and manuscript illumination. When the Ottomans arrived in 1455, the nuns had already heard what happened to their sisters in other conquered territories. The abbess, Mother Anastasia, made a desperate decision. She ordered the younger nuns to flee into the mountains, while she and the elderly sisters remained behind. They would face whatever came with prayer and dignity. The Ottoman soldiers found 43 elderly nuns waiting in the chapel. What happened next was recorded by a Hungarian merchant who arrived days later to trade with the Ottoman camp. His letter, preserved in the Vienna archives, describes scenes of such deliberate cruelty that even reading them 5 centuries later brings tears to the eyes. The elderly nuns were not simply killed. They were humiliated, tortured, made examples of. Their habits were torn away. They were paraded through the camp. Those who refused to renounce their faith faced punishments that grew progressively worse. Mother Anastasia herself was subjected to torments that the merchant could barely bring himself to describe. She died after 3 days, never once denying her faith. But death, terrible as it was not the worst fate awaiting captured nuns. The younger ones, those considered beautiful or strong enough for labor, faced a different horror entirely. The slave markets of Constantinople, Damascus, Cairo, and dozens of other Ottoman cities became the final destination for thousands of Christian nuns torn from their convents. Imagine the journey. Women who had lived their entire adult lives in prayer and contemplation, who had taken vows of chastity and dedicated themselves to God, were now chained together like animals, marched hundreds of miles through hostile territory. No privacy, no dignity, no hope. Many died on these forced marches. Ottoman records show that slave traders calculated a certain percentage of losses as simply the cost of business. Those who survived arrived at markets where their faith, their vows, their very identity meant nothing. The slave markets operated with brutal efficiency. Buyers inspected their potential purchases like livestock. Young nuns who had never known the touch of men were examined, evaluated, priced according to their beauty and presumed fertility. The prettier ones went to harems, others became domestic servants. The least fortunate ended up in brothels, a fate that many considered worse than death itself. We have a rare first-person account from Sister Maria of Corinth, who was captured in 1460 but managed to escape 7 years later. Her memoir, written in a shaking hand and hidden in a wall of a Greek monastery, describes the systematic breaking of captured nuns. They were forbidden to pray. Caught making the sign of the cross meant severe punishment. They were forced to wear Ottoman dress and adopt Muslim customs. Any resistance brought swift and terrible consequences. Sister Maria wrote about watching her fellow nuns slowly lose themselves. Some went mad from the trauma. Others found ways to end their own lives rather than endure another day. A few, she admits with deep sadness, eventually gave in, converting to Islam and disappearing into Ottoman society, their Christian identity erased forever. She herself survived by pretending to be mute, avoiding attention, and waiting for an opportunity that finally came when plague struck the household where she served. The Ottoman system was not content with merely conquering territory. It sought to transform it completely. Part of this transformation involved the deliberate targeting of Christian religious institutions. Convents were not just buildings to be looted. They were symbols to be destroyed, communities to be scattered, faith to be crushed. The Ottomans understood that nuns played a crucial role in maintaining Christian identity. They educated children, preserved religious texts, maintained traditions. Destroying them meant striking at the very heart of Christian communities. The Devshirme system added another layer of horror to this already dark picture. Every few years, Ottoman officials would arrive at Christian communities to collect their human tax. Boys would be taken to become Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Ottoman army. But girls were taken too, especially from convents that housed orphans. These children, raised by nuns in the Christian faith, were ripped away and forced into lives they never chose. The nuns who had raised these children as their own faced an impossible choice: resist and die, leaving the children with no protectors at all, or submit and watch as the children they loved were taken away forever. Many chose a third option, hiding children in crypts, wells, and forest caves, risking their own lives to save even a few innocent souls from the Ottoman collectors. The story of the Theodora Monastery in Greece illustrates this desperate courage. When Ottoman officials arrived in 1512 to collect children, they found the monastery apparently empty except for a handful of elderly nuns. The officials searched for 3 days, finding nothing. Frustrated, they tortured the elderly sisters for information. Not one revealed that 37 children were hidden in a secret chamber beneath the chapel floor, surviving on stored water and food, maintaining absolute silence for 72 hours. When the Ottomans finally left, every elderly nun was dead, but the children survived. Not all convents fell to direct military assault. Some faced a slower, more insidious destruction. Ottoman law imposed the jizya, a tax on non-Muslims that grew heavier with each passing year. Convents that had survived on donations and agricultural work found themselves unable to pay. When they defaulted, Ottoman authorities seized their lands, their buildings, everything. The nuns were expelled with nothing but the clothes on their backs, left to wander as beggars or seek shelter with increasingly rare Christian communities. The Meteora monasteries in Greece tell a different story. Built high on towering rock pillars, accessible only by rope ladders that could be pulled up, these communities of monks and nuns managed to resist Ottoman encroachment for centuries. But even they paid a terrible price. Cut off from the outside world, unable to recruit new members, watching their numbers dwindle year by year, They preserved their faith through isolation that was itself a form of imprisonment. Sometimes the cruelest acts came not from Ottoman soldiers, but from local populations who had converted to Islam and sought to prove their loyalty to their new masters. Former Christians who knew exactly where convents hid their treasures, which walls concealed secret chambers, which nuns came from wealthy families that might pay ransom. These betrayals cut deeper than any sword, for they came from those who had once been brothers and sisters in faith. The case of the Ljubostinja convent in Serbia reveals the complex nature of survival under Ottoman rule. The abbess, Mother Eugenia, made a controversial decision. She agreed to pay tribute to the local Ottoman governor, provide food for his troops, and even nurse wounded Ottoman soldiers back to health. Many called her a traitor, but her compromise kept the convent functioning for another 200 years, providing sanctuary for Christian women who had nowhere else to go. The moral complexity of such choices haunts us even today. How much compromise is acceptable to preserve something sacred? When does survival become collaboration? Hidden in archives across Eastern Europe are hundreds of letters from nuns to their families, smuggled out at great risk. They speak of daily humiliations. Christian symbols had to be hidden. Bells could not be rung. Singing of hymns was forbidden. Ottoman soldiers could enter convents at will, demanding food, supplies, whatever they wanted. The constant fear, the daily erosion of dignity, the slow crushing of spirit. Many letters end with the same plea: pray for us, remember us, do not forget we exist. One letter, from Sister Catherine to her brother in Venice, describes a particularly cruel practice. Ottoman authorities would sometimes force nuns to witness the execution of monks and priests, making them watch as their spiritual fathers were tortured and killed. Then they would ask the nuns if they still believed in their powerless God. Those who affirmed their faith faced the same fate. Those who remained silent were spared but broken, carrying guilt that no amount of prayer could wash away. The Ottoman conquest of Cyprus in 1571 provided European witnesses with detailed accounts of what befell the island's convents. Venetian refugees who escaped to Italy told of nuns being dragged from their cloisters and divided among Ottoman soldiers as spoils of war. The convent of St. Clara in Nicosia housed 60 nuns. When the city fell, the soldiers arrived at their gates. The abbess, knowing what was coming, led her sisters to the chapel, where they took poison rather than face capture. When the soldiers broke through, they found only corpses kneeling in prayer. But even in the darkest moments, extraordinary courage emerged. Sister Fotini of Constantinople spent 30 years as a slave in an Ottoman household, secretly maintaining her faith before managing to escape. Instead of seeking safety, she returned to Ottoman territory with forged documents, posing as a Muslim merchant woman. Over the next decade, she helped more than 100 Christian women escape slavery, creating an underground network that operated from Constantinople to Venice. When finally caught, she was offered freedom if she revealed her collaborators. She chose death instead, protecting the network that continued operating for another generation. The story of the Bulgarian convents adds another dimension to this tragedy. When the Ottomans conquered Bulgaria in the late 14th century, they found a thriving monastic tradition with dozens of convents. Within a century, fewer than 5 remained, but those 5 became centers of resistance, not through weapons, but through culture. They secretly taught children to read and write in Bulgarian. They preserved manuscripts that would have otherwise been destroyed. They maintained the Bulgarian language and identity through centuries of Ottoman rule. When Bulgaria finally gained independence in the 19th century, it was partly because these nuns had kept the flame of Bulgarian culture alive in the darkness. We must speak of the children. Convents across the Ottoman Empire often served as orphanages, caring for children whose parents had died from war, plague, or poverty. When these convents fell, the children faced fates perhaps even worse than the nuns. Boys young enough were circumcised and raised as Muslims, their Christian identity erased before it could fully form. Girls were raised for harems or domestic service, never knowing their true heritage. The nuns who had been their mothers in faith were forced to watch their children taken away, powerless to protect them. A French diplomat visiting Istanbul in 1547 wrote to his king about visiting the slave market. Among the human merchandise, he recognized several young women wearing remnants of religious habits beneath their slave clothes. When he inquired about purchasing their freedom, he was told the price for former nuns of noble birth was deliberately set impossibly high. They were trophies, proof of Ottoman dominance over Christianity. Some wealthy European families did manage to ransom individual nuns, but for everyone saved, hundreds remained in bondage. The psychological torture was often as devastating as the physical. Nuns were sometimes forced to serve in Ottoman households where they had to prepare meals during Christian fasting periods, handle items forbidden by their faith, listen to daily prayers to Allah, while being forbidden their own prayers to Christ. The deliberate erosion of identity, the forced participation in acts against their conscience, the slow grinding away of everything that made them who they were. Yet resistance took many forms. In Ottoman-controlled Greece, nuns developed elaborate codes to communicate between convents. Embroidered patterns on cloth carried messages. Songs with double meanings preserved forbidden prayers. Even the way vegetables were arranged in market baskets could convey information about Ottoman troop movements to Christian rebels. This shadow network of resistance operated for centuries, never fully discovered, never completely suppressed. The account of Sister Miriam of Damascus, discovered in a Cairo library in 1923, provides unique insight into the fate of Arab Christian nuns under Ottoman rule. She describes how convents in Syria and Palestine faced unique pressures. Local Ottoman administrators would accuse nuns of spying for European powers, using this as pretext for confiscation and persecution. The nuns, caught between their Ottoman rulers and suspicious local Muslim populations, lived in constant fear. Many convents simply disappeared, their nuns scattered to the winds, their buildings converted to other uses or left to crumble. Sometimes the greatest cruelties came from the smallest acts. Nuns forced to watch as icons they had venerated for generations were smashed. Manuscripts they had spent years copying burned for warmth. Sacred vestments used as cleaning rags. These deliberate degradations were designed to break spirits, to demonstrate the powerlessness of the Christian God and those who served him. The Ottoman period also saw the rise of crypto-Christianity, secret believers who publicly converted to Islam while privately maintaining their Christian faith. Many former nuns found themselves in this impossible position, especially those who had been forcibly married to Muslim men. They would teach their children Christian prayers disguised as lullabies, mark Christian holidays with subtle family traditions, keep faith alive in the most dangerous of circumstances. Discovery meant death, not just for them, but for their entire families. We have records of Ottoman courts dealing with cases of discovered crypto-Christians. The testimonies are heartbreaking. Former nuns, some elderly, after decades of hidden faith, standing trial for the crime of remaining Christian in their hearts. The Ottoman legal system, generally sophisticated for its time, showed no mercy in these cases. The standard sentence was death, sometimes preceded by torture to extract names of other secret Christians. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this history is how it has been forgotten. The Orthodox churches of the Balkans and Middle East remember their martyrs in prayers and icons, but the wider world has largely forgotten these women who suffered for their faith. Their stories were too painful, too controversial, too inconvenient for the narratives of both East and West. The Ottomans certainly had no interest in preserving these accounts. European powers, often seeking alliance with the Ottomans against each other, found these stories diplomatically awkward, and so the suffering of thousands of women was allowed to fade into historical obscurity. The numbers are staggering when we attempt to calculate them. Historians estimate that during the 6 centuries of Ottoman expansion and rule, tens of thousands of nuns were killed, enslaved, or forcibly converted. Each number represents a human being, a woman who had chosen a life of service and found instead a death of suffering. Each had a name, a story, hopes and fears, faith that was tested beyond human endurance. The convents that survived did so through miracles of courage and cleverness. They hid in mountains, bribed officials, made themselves useful to Ottoman authorities, or simply endured through sheer determination. When travelers in the 19th century began documenting Christian communities in Ottoman lands, they found convents that had maintained continuous operation for centuries under impossible conditions. Elderly nuns who could recite the names of every abbess going back to the Conquest, keeping memory alive when all written records had been destroyed. The end of Ottoman rule did not bring immediate relief. Many convents had been so thoroughly destroyed that they could never be rebuilt. The communities that had supported them were gone. The tradition of young women choosing religious life had been broken. In many places, Christianity itself had been so suppressed that there were simply no congregations left to support religious communities. Today, archaeologists occasionally discover evidence of destroyed convents. A few bones in what was once a chapel, fragments of burned manuscripts, a cross hidden in a wall. Each discovery is a reminder of what was lost, not just buildings and artifacts, but entire communities of women whose lives and faith were crushed by historical forces beyond their control. The legacy of this persecution extends beyond the immediate victims. Entire Christian communities in the Middle East and Balkans carry ancestral trauma from these events. Stories passed down through generations of what happened to great-great-grandmothers who were nuns. Family names changed to hide Christian origins. Religious practices modified or hidden to avoid persecution. The echoes of Ottoman persecution still resonate in communities from Serbia to Syria. Modern historians studying this period face unique challenges. Ottoman records, when they mention these events at all, use euphemistic language. Convents were redistributed. Nuns were relocated. The violence is hidden behind bureaucratic terminology. Christian sources, written by traumatized survivors or grieving relatives, are sometimes dismissed as exaggeration. Finding the truth requires careful comparison of multiple sources, archaeological evidence, and an understanding of the systematic nature of the persecution. What makes these events particularly tragic is that many Ottoman rulers and administrators knew better. The Ottoman Empire at its height was often more tolerant than contemporary European kingdoms. There were periods of relative peace when Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted productively. But for convents and their inhabitants, these periods of tolerance were brief exceptions to a general rule of persecution. The story of what the Ottomans did to Christian nuns is not one of simple barbarism. It is a complex tragedy of power, faith, resistance, and survival. It is about women who chose to face death rather than abandon their beliefs. It is about communities destroyed and somehow reborn. It is about faith tested beyond breaking point and somehow enduring. It is about the worst of human cruelty and the best of human courage existing in the same historical moment. We remember these women not to stoke hatred or division, but to honor courage that should never be forgotten. In an age where religious persecution continues in various forms around the world, their story remains relevant. They remind us that faith, genuine faith, sometimes demands everything. They remind us that there are things worth dying for and things worth living for, even when living means daily suffering. The Ottoman Empire has been gone for a century, but the scars remain. In abandoned monasteries across the Balkans, in the decimated Christian communities of the Middle East, in family stories whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, the memory persists. These were real women who lived, suffered, and died for their faith. They deserve more than historical footnotes. They deserve to be remembered with the full weight of their sacrifice acknowledged. Their story challenges us. In our comfortable modern world, where faith often costs nothing more than an hour on Sunday morning, what would we sacrifice for what we believe? When faced with the choice between comfortable apostasy and dangerous faith, what would we choose? These nuns made their choice, and that choice cost them everything. As we close this dark chapter of history, we must ask ourselves what lessons we take from it. Not lessons of hatred for descendants of persecutors, for they bear no guilt for their ancestors' crimes. not lessons of inevitable conflict between faiths, for history also shows us examples of peaceful coexistence, but lessons about the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary evil, lessons about the power of faith to sustain the human spirit through unimaginable suffering, lessons about the importance of remembering those whom history would prefer to forget. If this story has moved you, if these forgotten women have touched your heart across the centuries, then share their story. Don't let their sacrifice disappear into the silence of history. Subscribe to hear more untold stories from the past, stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the full complexity of human experience. Because in remembering the past, especially its darkest chapters, we honor those who suffered, and perhaps, just perhaps, we learn to build a better future. The drums of conquest have long since fallen silent. The slave markets have closed. The empire that seemed eternal has crumbled to dust. But the faith of those women, tested in fires we can barely imagine, somehow endures. In surviving convents across Eastern Europe and the Middle East, candles still burn for sisters who died centuries ago. Prayers are still offered for souls whose names are long forgotten, but whose sacrifice is remembered. And in that remembrance, perhaps there is a form of justice, a kind of immortality that no empire could grant or destroy.